Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us. I'm Vanessa Clough, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Engagement. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Professor Christian Matthes from the IU Department of Economics. A leading scholar at the intersection of macroeconomics and econometrics, Professor Matthes' research focuses on dynamic equilibrium models, time series analysis, and imperfect information in economic modeling. Before joining the IU faculty in 2019, he worked in the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Following his presentation, Professor Matthes will be joined by economics PhD student Anthony Vecchia for the audience Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Closed captioning is also available. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Matthes for his presentation. Thank you.
And let me start off by echoing what Vanessa said. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation, hopefully to interact, ask any questions you might have. Here at IU, at the college, and certainly in the economics department at IU, we greatly value whenever we have a chance to interact with our great alumni. What I'll talk about today, as the title says, I'll talk about the economic outlook for the United States. So what will I cover tonight? The US economy is a huge topic. There's many different things I could talk about, so I had to narrow it down somewhat. The big question is that I'll try to address, or at least give an idea about, is what's the current economic situation? Here I'll focus on the entire US, so there's not going to be anything here about Indiana specifically, but it's really about the US as a whole. In particular, I want to focus on the question of how our current situation, which in many ways is unique, I'll admit, but how does that current situation compare to previous historical episodes? Now, when I talk about historical, I could look at different time frames. Here, mostly I'll talk about 1980 and afterwards. So periods that most of us will remember, or maybe not. Maybe I'm just old. In particular, I'll talk about 4 broad areas of economic data. I'll talk about labor markets, kind of a key aspect of economic data I think we're all interested in. How easy is it to find a job? How much are we getting paid? Then I'll go on to talk about gross domestic product, a measure of the overall amount of goods produced and services provided in the economy, overall a measure of how well the economy is doing. The third key topic I'll talk about is inflation. I've highlighted that here in red because that's really fresh on our mind. I think for all of us, we've lived through a recent bout of inflation, and we'll talk about what the current situation is. And certainly then we'll talk about economic policy, or to a large extent, what got us here and what can policymakers do to help the US economy. And here I'll focus in particular on interest rates. Why? Because interest rates are very closely connected, in particular to monetary policy, but also to fiscal policy. So that's the broad overview of what I'll cover tonight. Obviously, after the presentation, feel free to ask questions about other topics as well. I might not have any answers, but I'll try my best. Oh yeah, so obviously the last bullet point, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now in the US economy. I'll talk a little bit more about that. How do economists measure this uncertainty? And I'll have some thoughts on where we're headed. So let me start off with labor market data. What I'll show you today is a lot of graphs. Let's start out with probably the quintessential indicator for labor market data, namely the unemployment rate. A lot of the graphs that I'll show you today will have the same format. On the x-axis here below, it'll be time. So that kind of starts in 1980 and goes until the the current period. On the y-axis, we'll have our variable of interest. And then sometimes in some of the graphs, you'll see these gray bars. These gray bars are just there for you as an additional guide. These gray bars tell us at what times were the United States in a recession. In the United States, there's one body named the National Bureau of Economic Research that looks at a large amount of different data sources to decide whether or not the US is in a recession. Okay. And we'll kind of use that as a guidepost because economic data sometimes behaves very differently when we're in a recession versus an expansion. So let's stare at this graph a little bit. I think there's a lot we can learn from this. First, we can look at the very recent time period over here, and we see that compared to this entire time series, going back to 1980, the unemployment rate is very low. Okay? So you can look at the 1990s, for example, a time period that we generally think of as relatively prosperous, but for a lot of the 1990s, the unemployment rate was quite a bit higher than it is now. Second, if you're worried about the unemployment rate, you see a slight uptick in the very recent data in the last couple of years. But again, putting things in a historic perspective, the unemployment rate is really low. In particular, that is actually quite remarkable. When you think about an international comparison, the US labor market has proven to be incredibly resilient, meaning not only is the unemployment rate on average very low these days, it has also fallen a lot very fast after COVID. So this huge spike in the unemployment rate was COVID. Before I go on, you might say, okay, maybe this is all there is to know about the labor market. No, because the unemployment rate measures only something very particular. The unemployment rate measures how many people are unemployed, but importantly, looking for a job relative to the overall size of the labor force. The overall size of the labor force is everybody who's currently working or looking for a job. So if you know somebody who's not working, but also not looking for a job, they will not appear in this data right here. As such, this only gives a partial view of the labor market. If, for example, nobody was looking for a job, the unemployment rate would be 0, even if many people didn't have jobs. That's why we also want to look at other measures that tell us how healthy the labor market is. One such series is quits. They tell us how many people voluntarily quit their jobs. This series is only available for a shorter time period starting in 2000. In general, we think of very broadly of there being more quits in situations where the economy is doing well. Why? Because people will quit their job because they think they have other opportunities to get a better job. And we can kind of see this. In the gray areas here, when there's a recession, quits fall. Okay, during COVID, very few people quit their job. Overall, we see currently quits are relatively high compared to the historical average. That again tells us US labor markets seem to be doing reasonably well. Quits have come down somewhat, so there might be some cooling in the labor market, but still, compared to the historical data we have, things seem to be going well. The next aspect of the labor market in the United States I want to focus on is labor force participation, meaning how many people are either employed or looking for a job relative to the overall population. If you want to get technical, this is the non-institutionalized population. And so what do we see here? We see that actually over time, especially since the early 2000s, labor force participation has fallen. It then stabilized between 2015 up to COVID, but then COVID led to a big fall. There's been a slight increase afterwards, but we're not back to these levels before 2020. And in particular, we're certainly not back to levels since the mid-1990s. I'm pointing this out for one specific reason. This means there are a lot of people that are actually not in the labor force right now. So in some sense, for people that are looking for a job, it seems the US economy is doing very well in terms of labor markets. But there is a lot of untapped potential in some sense in the US economy in terms of the labor force. The next feature I want to talk about are wages. Okay, so there's very good data on wages that is being tracked by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. They're doing a great job making that data available. Now, this exact figure I've taken from a recent article, actually published earlier this week by the Harvard economics professor Jason Furman in Foreign Affairs. Actually, an article I highly recommend you read. It really gives great insights about the economic situation of the US in the last couple of years. But what I want to focus here is this great graph that he compiled on wages. What does this graph show us? It shows us how much wages have grown for two different time periods. Black bars show us 2014 to 2019, and then red bars show us 2020 to 2024. So the recent Biden presidency. What are these different figures, these different bars for wage growth? Here we're looking at how much wages grow for people with relatively low wages up to people with relatively high wages. And the way that Furman does this, the way also the Atlanta Fed reports their data is in quartiles. So they say, what does wage growth look like for the people that are in the lowest 25% of the wage distribution, then from 25 to 50%, and so on. Now I want to show two features. First, let's look from left to right. Both the black bars and the red bars show us that wage growth has been higher for both time periods. When for lower earning labor market participants relative to higher earning participants. Okay, so for the black bars, this goes down, and for the red bars as well. So this is actually something that's I think it's interesting and not a lot of people know. You know, we always have this idea that the rich get richer, and maybe that's true. But if we only think about wage income, this is not true. Since 2014, the wage distribution has compressed. Okay, I do want to point out that this is what economists call real wage growth, so controlling for inflation. So this is not a pure inflation effect. This is really an apples to apples comparison. The second feature I want to highlight is now comparing black bars to red bars. So seeing how high wage growth was from 2014 to 2019 relative to 2020 to 24. And we see that for each group, no matter if you earned relatively low wages or relatively high wages, your wage has not grown as much in the recent period compared to the earlier period. In particular, if you are in the highest earning 25%, if your wages belongs to the highest 25% of wages, you've actually seen your wage decrease. Again, this is real wages, controlling for inflation. We've had relatively high inflation in this time period. So I think that's something that's useful to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about wages or income changes. Actually, in terms of only wage income, we have not seen a spreading out of that distribution. Now, I want to go back to thinking about labor force. How many people are in the labor force? This is going to be my last slide on the labor market. And here I want to show you an international comparison. No, and this is related, but not exactly the same as the labor force participation series that I showed you earlier. What I'm showing you here is for what economists call prime age labor for prime age people, meaning between 25 and 54, the employment to population ratio. How many people are employed versus the overall size of the population for those aged between 25 and 54. This, instead of being a time series, this looks at one particular point in time, namely the third quarter of last year. That's what I had data for. But that's where I could find data for. And this looks now across countries. Before, and for most of the rest of this presentation, I'll focus in the United States. But here, I think it's really instructive to look at an international comparison. And you can actually see that the United States, that's this red bar, has relatively low employment to population ratio, less than 85%. Other countries have a much higher employment to population ratio. The highest of the sample here that I'm looking at is Iceland, which has about 93%. But even many other countries, mainly in Europe, have much higher, closer to 90% group of countries here. It's kind of interesting to think about why that is. Actually, a big part of this is females not being in the labor force or not being employed. Right? In a lot of these countries, a lot of European countries, much bigger part of prime age females are employed or at least are in the labor force. That's not the case in the United States. Again, this is not a judgment call, but what I want to say is that there seems to be some untapped potential there in terms of the labor force. Even though the unemployment rate is very low in the United States, it seems to me there's still room to grow in terms of how much labor can be used in the US economy. I find that a useful kind of comparison to keep in mind. So this ends the first block, labor market data. Overall, my takeaway is the US labor market is very resilient. It's in great shape. If you're looking for a job, chances are you can find a job. Now, obviously, locally, things might look different, but across the US economy as a whole, that seems to be true. And it also seems to be that in terms of wages, if anything, those that earn relatively low wages have seen their wages grow more than high wage earners. Next, I want to shift gears. I want to look at gross domestic product. This is the amount of goods produced and services provided in the US economy. I want to plot this over time, same format of the graph that we've already seen before. What I plot here is real gross domestic product, real again meaning taking into account any changes in inflation. And second, I'm plotting this per capita. Why? The US has grown, US population has grown a lot. But we want to have an apples to apples comparison here. So it's always useful for economists usually do this. They plot per capita GDP, or per capita variables more generally. What's the most striking feature of this is this clear upward trend, right? Since 1980, GDP has grown tremendously. Again, per person, even taking into account inflation, even taking into account that the US population has grown. In general, we see during recessions, those are the gray bars here, GDP either falls or stagnates. And we see this most clearly here in COVID in 2020, but afterwards, the US economy has picked up very strongly again. This is not something that we see across a lot of other developed economies. Many other developed economies, particularly in Europe, have struggled after COVID. Maybe they had a smaller fall in GDP during COVID, but the recovery afterwards has generally been much, much weaker. This is not the case for the United States. The United States, in terms of GDP, has grown relatively strong. When I showed you GDP just now, I took out the effects of inflation, but we all worry about inflation, right? We all worry about prices going up. So I think it's useful to talk about it. So here I'm showing you some data compiled by my former colleagues at the Richmond Fed that looks at some recent inflation data. If you're very up to date with your economic news, you know that there was actually a new price release for the so-called consumer price index today, and I'll briefly mention that in a second. Let me first say a couple of words about how economists measure inflation. We measure inflation by looking at a certain bundle of goods, like sometimes a representative amount of goods that someone would buy, usually in an urban area. What is it? That is groceries, that includes gas, that includes housing, like rent. Okay, rent or equivalent measures for housing make up a big part of price indices and of movements in inflation. The Federal Reserve, for example, mainly looks at so-called personal consumption expenditure-based price indices. There is a related measure, that's the one that came out today, so-called consumer price indices. They differ in the specific bundle of goods that they look at, but overall, they're very similar. They usually tell a very similar story. The levels might be slightly different, but overall movements in one are usually reflected in the other. Another measure of inflation we can look at is how much do firms actually have to pay in terms of prices. So not us as final goods consumers, but a company that produces groceries, that produces cars in the US, how much do they have to pay? And how do their prices change? That's something that, for example, the Federal Reserve also tracks very closely, so-called producer price indices, because those will usually ultimately lead to changes in how much we as final consumers have to pay. And so what do we see here? We see that first, looking at November and December data for the PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index, we see that there is an acceleration from 1.5% month over month at an annual rate to 3%. The Consumer Price Index, again, because it measures inflation slightly differently, tends to have slightly higher numbers. We see this here, 3.8 month over month at an annual rate in November, then 4.8 in December. And today a new number came out in January that was even higher. In January, that number was 5.7. Okay. So we see actually, at least in the short run, an acceleration of inflation again. This has led to the year-over-year number now being 3%. What does that 3% mean year over year? That means if you could buy a basket of goods for $100 a year ago, now you'd have to pay $103. That's what 3% inflation is. We can also, and this is something central banks do a lot, they look at so-called core measures of inflation. You sometimes read that in the news, so it might be useful to briefly discuss this. This excludes food and energy. Now, you might first scratch your head. Why do economists want to exclude food and energy, energy meaning, for example, gas, when we actually spend a lot of our money on food and energy? You know, when you go to the grocery store, that's what you buy off food and energy, gas. At least when you shop at a grocery store like I do, then get gas as well. Why do economists look at core inflation? They look at core inflation because their food and energy prices are usually really volatile, right? We want to get a sense of like, what will inflation be in the not too distant future? How will prices change going forward? So there it's useful to exclude these really volatile prices that change a lot from one month to the next. We see if we do this, numbers are a little bit lower, but still pretty high, almost 3% in December. When it comes to producer price indices, in general, there's a lot of variability and a lot of heterogeneity. Okay? For example, if you look at intermediate goods, actually prices have fallen. But then there are other goods where prices have increased a lot. Again, producer price indices tend to be very volatile. So overall, my takeaway is, in the very short run, also given the economic data we saw today, inflation seems to be going up again. Hopefully not nearly to the levels we've seen over the last couple of years. This is what this plot shows us, but it's going up. This shows inflation since 2007. Again, using personal consumption expenditures. I focus here a little bit on personal consumption expenditures more than consumer price indices, or the CPI, because this is the preferred measure for the Federal Reserve. And you can see here, I put, or my former colleagues put a dashed line at 2%, because that's the Federal Reserve's inflation target, 2% as measured by personal consumption expenditures. Okay, if we go to the period, if we look at the period right after COVID, we see this huge spike that we unfortunately all remember too well. What's interesting here that I want to highlight is that this also gives us forecasts. This gives us Federal Reserve forecasts for what the Federal Reserve thinks inflation will be over the next couple of years. They think inflation will be elevated relative to the inflation target over the next year or 2 years, but then ultimately will return back to the inflation target at a medium horizon. I mean, they almost have to say that. If they didn't, they would have to change their policy. But at the very least, what we can certainly take away from this is that over the next year or two, we should expect elevated inflation relative to the Fed's inflation target of 2%. Now, a key question that we probably all have is, how did we get here? And obviously a big part of that is COVID and how policymakers have responded to COVID. And I want to show you one graph. It's really one of my favorite graphs in economics. It's out of a paper by George Hall and Tom Sargent. Tom Sargent won the Nobel Prize in economics about 10, 15 years ago. And what I want to highlight with this graph is like, how much does the US government spend? And here, what I want to focus on is the blue line that gives us government outlays net of interest. Okay, so the US government borrows money, it has to pay back that money with interest. Let's take that out of the conversation. Let's really think about the outlays, other things the government does with money. And I'm going to, and Paul and Sargent plot this as a percent of GDP relative to how much the economy produces. And what do we see? We see first 3 very prominent spikes. We saw a big spike in government outlays in World War I, World War II, and during COVID. Hence the title of this paper. They call it 3 World Wars: World War I, World War II, and the war against COVID. Interestingly enough, if you remember back to 2009, 2010, the financial crisis, we also saw government expand outlays, but this was much smaller than what we saw during COVID and certainly during the 2 world wars. The second thing second feature I want to highlight here is there seems to be some sort of ratchet effect. After these big events, after World War I, World War II, and after COVID, outlays relative to GDP fall, but they don't fall back to the original level, but to a higher level. And here we see the same for COVID. Now, this is a paper that's a couple of years old. So they used the forecast here, but this forecast came out roughly right. We again see there was a fall in government outlays after COVID, but not back to the previous level, but instead to an elevated level. This obviously has effects. This has effects. If the government spends more money, that means there'll be a higher demand for goods. General inflation will go up. If the government borrows more money, also ultimately someone has to pay for it. That's a big part of it. That affects government borrowing, hence interest rates. And so I want to talk a little bit about interest rates. And what I've plotted here are a couple of different interest rates. And you see they differ in their levels, but they actually move pretty much in lockstep. What I'm plotting here are 2 corporate bond rates. They basically tell us how much do companies have to pay in interest if they want to borrow money. We're looking at a AAA rate, meaning these are firms that are very creditworthy, and then we're looking at firms that are a little bit less creditworthy, that have a lower credit rating. Then, maybe most interesting for all of us, we're looking at the 30-year conventional mortgage rate, and then we're looking at how much the government has to pay to borrow. That's the 10-year Treasury rate. So the 10-year Treasury rate is this lowest series here that I'm tracing out. And we can see that over the last couple of years, all these interest rates have gone up tremendously. Okay, so if you bought a house at this right after COVID, you're one of the lucky ones. You're buying a house right now, maybe not so much in terms of the mortgage rate. Why are interest rates going up that much? Partly because the Federal Reserve has influenced interest rates. It has raised interest rates, and that has an effect on a lot of interest rates in the market. Why has the Federal Reserve raised interest rates? Well, let me go back. Because it wanted to bring inflation down. If you've ever taken a class on macroeconomics or monetary economics while you were at IU, you remember one thing the Federal Reserve will do to tackle inflation is to raise interest rates. But also there are other parts here of this movement that are explained, for example, by fiscal policy. I mentioned if the government spends more, it either has to tax more or borrow more. If you borrow more, you generally have to pay a higher interest rate. So both fiscal and monetary policies here have led us to this increase in interest rates. Where are we going with this? Where are we going in terms of the economy? There's massive uncertainty. I think no matter the political leaning, you'll have to say there's a lot of uncertainty about fiscal policy going forward. How much will we spend? How much will we tax? We as the US economy. What will happen to monetary policy? Again, today we got a really high inflation reading. Some people will say that this is actually partially due to some idiosyncrasies of the data. But nonetheless, inflation certainly came in higher than what the Federal Reserve wanted. So it's not clear what the Federal Reserve will do in the long run. It has certainly paused interest rates, lowering interest rates. One might even argue if the higher inflation readings persist, it might have to increase interest rates again. Finally, something that's on everybody's mind, at least in the news, is tariffs. Part of fiscal policy, but I wanted to highlight it here separately. What will the US economy do in terms of tariffs with its major trading partners? That obviously has a direct effect on us as customers. A lot of the goods that I consume, probably a lot of the goods that you're consuming as well, are coming in from abroad. If there are tariffs on these goods, there's a good chance that producers will pass these on to us as consumers. I want to highlight that there's a lot of really tremendous work being done right here at IU in the econ department on international trade and studying trade policy, studying tariffs. We have a lot of fantastic trade economists on faculty. My colleagues Mustafa Beshkar, Ahmad Lashkaripur, and Vova Lugovsky have all done tremendous work thinking about the effects that increases in tariffs, or changes in tariff policy can have on economic outcomes. And I'll actually show you a little bit of that. Before I go there, let me briefly say a word about how economists measure policy uncertainty. Right? I've said we're in this area of era of increased policy uncertainty. There are a lot of different ways we could measure this. One very famous one is by Baker, Plume, and Davis, cited down here. What they do is they actually look at newspapers or news in general and measure how often news actually mention policy uncertainty. They do this in a very sophisticated way, and it's a really useful measure. We see here, this starts right after COVID or during COVID. Obviously, during COVID, there was a lot of uncertainty. Policymakers were struggling to come up with reasonable measures to help the economy. After COVID, economic policy uncertainty went back down. Now, since the election, it's on an uptick again. This is important insofar as that a higher policy uncertainty can lead firms to stop investing, right? If a firm, for example, gets a lot of its intermediate inputs from abroad, maybe it's going to be less investment. It's going to be less hiring because they don't know how much tariffs they'll have to, how much tariffs they'll be charged indirectly via increased prices from their importers. So even objective measures of economic policy uncertainty have been on the uptick. Now, what do tariffs do to the U.S. economy and other economies as well? First, let me briefly discuss a study by the Peterson Institute, a think tank, but a very serious think tank that does a lot of really good quantitative modeling on issues like this. This is a series of graphs, two graphs, that show the effects of 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. What would the effects be on the US economy? That's in black here, on Canada in purple, and Mexico in green. We see for all these economies, there would be a decrease in GDP. That's what this graph shows. It shows percent changes projected, estimated percent changes in real GDP. However, interestingly, we actually see that the decline is smallest for the United States, but much, much larger for Canada, and in particular Mexico. Mexico will be hit really hard, both in terms of GDP, but also in terms of inflation. So if you look at inflation, the estimates here for the US are actually not that bad. So here the projected increase in inflation is about 0.5 percentage point. I told you that the latest reading of CPI inflation came in at 5.7. So comparing magnitudes here, is a 0.5 percentage point increase in inflation great? No, but it's not a crazy amount either. Similarly, for GDP, okay? So estimates here of the effects of these tariffs on US GDP are that it would lower US GDP, but it would not be a substantial recession. So there is this substantial heterogeneity in what tariffs do to economies. And here I want to mention great work done by my colleague Ahmad Lashkaripur that I already mentioned. So Ahmad, in one of his papers, he estimated not only for the US, but for the entire world economy, what would be the cost of a tariff war? What do economists mean when they talk about a tariff war? They mean one country raising tariffs, but then other countries also raising tariffs in return, something that we've seen before, something that we might see again. And there are two interesting features. I want to focus on one here. There's a couple of different lines. These lines differ in what assumption Ahmad is making on the model economy that he studies. Okay, but what's common across all these different assumptions is that these lines go up over time. Over time, these tariff wars, these mutual increases in tariffs across the world economy have increased a lot in cost. Why is that? Because the world economy has become a lot more open. So maybe to summarize, from a US point of view, if we're only looking at these tariffs on Canada and Mexico in isolation, maybe things aren't that bad. But if other countries counteract with their own tariffs, and then we take a broader perspective of what this means for most of the developed world and even the less developed world, we would see tremendous costs. So that also, again, shows the uncertainty. We don't know exactly how other countries will react. We don't even know exactly what the US will do in terms of tariffs. So let me sum up here. I think my takeaway is that the US economy is doing well for now. Inflation is maybe a tad high, but it's also come down a lot. That doesn't mean that there aren't winners or losers. We've seen this in this wage distribution. And going forward, there's a lot of heightened uncertainty. That's reflected in forecasts, whether or not you look at forecasts by the government, by the Federal Reserve, by professional forecasters. They will all acknowledge that, yeah, there's a lot that could happen right now. But as we stand right now, the US economy is doing well. And I think that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you for all those great insights about the near-term economic outlook. playing on the theme of uncertainty, I think undoubtedly we'll have lots of questions. So I'd like to remind everybody, if you want to ask a question, navigate down to the Q&A tab. Should see it on the bottom of your screen if you want to ask a question. All right, so looks like we have some already in the queue, so we'll get started here. So Sarah asks, does the wage data include things like bonuses and stock options?
That's a great question. So very often I would have to go back and look at this and look at the exact definition. Very often it does not. So especially stock options, these are really hard to price into the wage data. This is usually really bottom line take home pay. And so this is certainly a great point. Stock options, things like that. Those play a big role. This is really just take home wages. So in some sense, let me just maybe say one more thing because I really like this question. This means, like any one data series, this only paints a partial picture of what's going on. It's also but it is much harder to get data on these complete compensation packages.
We have another question here from Patricia. Are females in or are they not in the labor force? And referring to the data on the employment to population ratio specifically, do you think that the United States being on the lower end is because for other countries on the chart, they provide daycare for small children so mothers can work, but in the United States, we do not?
Yeah, so I think a big part of this labor force participation in the United States being low is indeed females. And it is true that in a lot of these countries, especially there were a lot of European countries in that graph, they do provide daycare. I think particularly about Scandinavia, for example. Remember, Iceland was technically a part of Scandinavia. Was like the one with the highest labor force participation. So yes, this matters, right? The easier you make it for people to be in the labor force, the more likely they are to be in the labor force. Absolutely.
All right, here's another from Ronald. What confidence, if any, do you have in key economic decision makers in the Trump administration?
So let me say this. Recently, Trump announced the Trump administration announced members of their Council of Economic Advisors, and they have fantastic economists there. For example, Kim Rule, who is a very, very well-known trade economist, actually thinking about international trade, and is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. They also have very prominent macroeconomists there. So at the very least, in terms of advice, the Trump administration will have a lot of very good advice. Otherwise, I think there is a lot of uncertainty. Then that is definitely true. But those appointments to the Council of Economic Advisors did give me hope.
All right, from Zachary, how likely is an onset of a recession in the next 2 years?
There's a lot of uncertainty. 2 years is a lot can happen in 2 years. I think right now the U.S. economy is doing very, very well. I think I'm hesitant to put a probability number to this. Maybe I'll twist the question a little bit, and I'll give you like what I expect to be the most likely scenario, again with a lot of uncertainty surrounding it. My most likely scenario is that we'll see more of a cool down in the labor market. We'll see unemployment rates rise a bit, but unless we see some big shocks happening, unless we really see tariffs, say Chinese tariffs, ramping up a lot, I don't think a recession is very likely. But I will also say this: recessions are some of the hardest things to predict because recessions happen very quickly. We saw that a little bit with the unemployment data that I showed you. We see a recession starts, and all of a sudden the unemployment rate jumps up. It's just very hard to predict these, what economists call turning points. But yeah, my my best guess right now is I would expect some cooling of the U.S. economy. But this also depends on fiscal policy. What will we see in terms of tax changes, for example?
All right, we have another question here from Cesar. What explains the US being the country that loses the least in terms of output and inflation with the new tariffs? Do you have a sense on how the immigration policies could change that story?
So I think part of that, a big part of this, and I'm not a trade economist, as I mentioned, I have other colleagues who will be much better suited to answer this question. My impression is that the US economy still is a relatively closed economy, whereas Mexico and Canada are really reliant on exporting goods to the United States. So, and they're smaller economies. So these tariffs hit a bigger part of their production, of their GDP. In terms of immigration, I think that's still up in the air because also we don't know yet what the exact policies will be. How much will it actually change labor forces? Labor force. Well, how much will it change the labor force? We know in certain areas, like construction, at least in parts of the country, immigrants are really important. So we'll have to see like what are the magnitudes? How much will the labor force change in response to these immigration policies?
Going back here a little bit, we actually have a follow-up question from Zachary here. Is the business cycle at a peak? If not, why?
So I would not say it's at a peak right now, just because, you know, the unemployment rate's already going back up a little bit. So I think we're already in a cooling phase. GDP is still doing reasonably well. So ultimately, the business cycle is really kind of this multi-dimensional thing, right? You can look at a lot of different, you should look at labor market data there. As I mentioned, if you look at labor market data, you see a bit of a cooling down already. GDP still looks pretty good. So I would say we're not at the very peak. We're not at the highest growth rates right now. We're not at lowest unemployment. Yeah.
Right. All right. We have Ron here, says he read a book, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, and he has a question. Is the deficit a real threat to the economy?
Yeah. So this has been a big discussion in economics. And I would say, yeah, I mean, I Israelis would say yes, in the following sense that, you know, if the US government spends money, it has to be financed somehow. It either has to be financed by borrowing, printing money, or by taxing. So, the government also has a budget constraint. Now, obviously, the government is in a kind of special situation. It doesn't have a budget constraint like you or me, because the government is so big that when it takes actions, it influences the entire macroeconomy. So there are very interesting and important feedback mechanisms. And in particular, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that IU Emeritus Eric Leeper has done tremendous work on what he called, or people call, the fiscal theory of the price level, that really thinks about how fiscal policy and changes in fiscal policy, in particular expectations of future fiscal policy, affect inflation today. So these types of questions have a long history and tradition here in Indiana. But if you're coming back to the original question, I think that, you know, government budgets matter. We will, if the government decides to spend a lot more and does so by borrowing, the government will have to pay higher interest rates. That's something that ultimately we will all feel, because the government will have to pay back those loans.
But my question has to do with the Federal Reserve. So do you think the Fed raised rates too late? And if so, do you think there are any lingering consequences that they must consider today? And if you don't mind, I don't mean to overload you, but inflation has been above 2%, and they have promised kind of this asymmetric target around 2%. Do you think they'd let it go below 2% for some time?
Okay, so that's a loaded question.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. So let me start with the last part. So this asymmetric inflation targeting, I strongly believe was a very, very bad idea. And just to give some context to everybody listening, so the Federal Reserve a couple of years ago kind of changed its policy, thinking about, if inflation for a long time was below their target of 2%, they would let the economy run above 2% for a little while, just kind of for the price level to catch up. So personally, I think this was a really bad idea because this was a change in Federal Reserve policy that was born out of a very specific economic situation in the mid-2010s when inflation had been running slightly below inflation target for a couple of years, and the Fed was really worried about this relatively minor discrepancy. So to be honest, I don't know how seriously people actually take this asymmetric targeting in practice. Yeah, and did the Fed react too late? Yes, I think even within the Federal Reserve System, there's now consensus the Fed did react too late. Now, obviously, hindsight is 2020. At the time, there was a discussion. I think many people, including myself, said from the beginning that the Fed should have been more aggressive. Jay Powell came down on not wanting to raise interest rates. And yeah, in retrospect, I think it was a mistake. There was enough economic data to suggest that inflation was not as temporary as they thought it would be.
Right. We do have another question here from Jeff. What explains the loss in wages over the last 4 to 5 years among the highest earners?
A lot of it has to do with high inflation, I think. A lot of high inflation paired with a lot of wage increases tend to come when people change jobs. If you stay in your job, usually pay increases are relatively minor and often do not keep track with inflation. So I would have to look at the data in more detail to give a more precise answer, but that's my strong hunch.
All right. I think we're at the point for one more question. So what are some factors that you think are keeping the labor force participation rate down in the United States?
So my impression is, and this mirrors my answer to a previous question, is, for example, childcare. Childcare is one thing. Another thing, and it's a more recent, probably after COVID, there was a lot of issues with long COVID. Now the question is obviously this would have affected the rest of the world economy as well. But if you just look at the U.S. time series, I think that's a big thing. A lot of people were not willing or could not go back into the labor force. But that's still a very active area of research. And I think one that where more work is needed. Because again, I think there's a lot of untapped potential there for the U.S. economy in terms of the labor force.
Of course. All right. So we've reached the end here. Of course, there's lots of questions that could be asked about this topic, but for now we're done. So I'll give it back to Vanessa to say some final words here.
Great. Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to personally thank Professor Matthes and Mr. Vecchia for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. I would like to acknowledge the IU Alumni Association for assisting with tonight's event. And finally, I should recognize that efforts like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support programs like this evening's event or other opportunities that connect alumni and friends with the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the IU Bloomington College Alumni Engagement Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. We look forward to connecting you with the college and each other again soon. Until next time, please take care.